Hello and welcome to the Lloyd's Register webinar on the Pressure Equipment Directive and using subcontractors. I'll introduce you to our speaker in a moment, but first would like to say that if you have any questions, you can submit by email to inspection@lr.org and one of our PED specialists will respond to you. So now let's introduce our speaker, Peter Roberts.
Thanks, Sam. So today I'm going to try and give you an insight into how you ensure that the subcontractors that you might use is competent for the work that you want them to do. So just going through the contents of what we're going to look at today. Obviously my name is Peter Roberts and I'll be giving this brief overview. So subcontractors, it's important to choose a suitable contractor who's competent and the company, either an individual or a company. The contract on the contractor is really important. The documentation that's provided to support what the work they've undertaken is also really important to ensure that the work they've done is documented and addressed as it needs to be. The CE marking obviously is a legal requirement and the PED requires that any assembly or any equipment operating greater than half a bar has to be assessed, and if the assembly is categorized then you would have to CE mark it, and all the parts within that assembly which require CE marking would also need to be CE marked. Okay, so my history, if you like, I worked in the steel industry in the manufacturing of forgings and castings at Riverdon. And I was there for about 10 years and worked in all aspects of manufacture and also worked in the Met Lab. I left and worked at a pressure vessel manufacturer and became the chief inspector and looked after welding and quality NDT, which included ultrasonics and radiography and dye penetrant and MPI. And was there for about 5 years, and then I went to work for an inspection company, Vetco Inspection, and we worked on valves mainly for the offshore industry, wellhead equipment, etc. And then following that, I was at TUV for 19 years and became chief inspector there, and looked after quality as well. So we got our accreditation to EN 45004 as it was then. I worked to all the German codes, the AD Merkblatt, the TRB as it was called, the TRD for boilers, the TRG for gas cylinders. With LR I mainly covered global assemblies in the last few years and training and PED mainly in relation to the global assemblies and the CE marking of those assemblies. The training encompassed not only LR personnel but clients as well. I've given many training courses to clients and got good feedback. I'm a level 3 in NDT and an authorised ASME inspector and an approved auditor. So overview, you've won a contract and you don't have the resource to manufacture everything. This contract could cover anything from welding, NDT, forming, testing, NDT, design, and to a lesser extent painting. Painting is not really covered by the PED, but obviously the other aspects would be. You've got to decide on a contractor. How would you do that? Well, basically you have to ensure that the contractor was competent and suitable and has the relevant experience. So the following slides I'll try and give you some insight into some of the questions that we would ask to ensure that a contractor is suitable, so that if you as a manufacturer are employing a subcontractor, it gives you some confidence in the approach that you take. So the overview of the processes obviously is you've got to raise a purchase order and identify who the subcontractor is. Obviously price is really important, but my main concern is that the requirements are met by a contractor to ensure that the equipment is safe for its intended application. So the manufacturer under the PED is really important, and manufacturers, importers, distributors and authorised representatives are all listed in Articles 6, 7, 8 and 9, and these give you some indication of the manufacturer's responsibility. So a manufacturer might subcontract design, manufacture of equipment, inspection and testing. But even so, if he's CE marking it, he takes full responsibility for that equipment. So it's imperative that you employ a competent subcontractor, and that's essential. I can't emphasise this enough. The manufacturer takes full responsibility, and now the new Declaration of Conformity, Annex 4 of the PED, that states now that the manufacturer takes full responsibility. So when you write your DFC, it actually says it in that. So choosing a competent subcontractor. If you worked with subcontractors before, it gives you a good feeling, because you know what they can do, you know what experiences they've got, and you've got an idea of what they're good at and what they're not good at, and that's useful. But if you're going onto the marketplace and you don't know who to use, you haven't been involved with anybody, then you've got to look at how you perform an assessment to make sure that they are appropriate. So look at details of any approvals that they've had. You know, have they got approval to 9001? I don't know many manufacturers or companies that do perform welding or NDC haven't currently got some sort of approval, but have a look at this approval, have a look at the reports that's been issued against this approval, ask to see them. Obviously they're confidential documents, but if you're going to a contractor, then they've got to be open with you and show you any issues that they may have had following the assessments, and look at the findings logs in these assessments to see if there's any major non-conformances that could affect whether you would employ that subcontractor. Have a look at the organisation chart, find out who's responsible for what within the organisation. Make sure that the people in relation to quality have a clear connection with the various areas that they cover, and got access to the managing director or manager of the department. Obviously design could also come into this, choosing a subcontractor. Has the manufacturer done this type of work before? You know, as the design engineer, is he competent? Has he worked to ASME B313 if it's for piping, or if it's 13482, which is the harmonised piping standard? That could also be something that you could look at. Is evidence in relation to the standards that's applied. These standards are really important, and they must be up to date, because obviously if you work into an out of date standard, then you might not do it fully in accordance with the standards required. And in the PD, it requires that you use state of the art documents. You could perform an audit on the subcontractor to ensure that the work that you want them to do, if they're doing heat treatment, you could go in and just have a look at the processes, have a look at the procedures, have a look at the calibration of the equipment that they're using, and make sure that all these areas are covered within the procedure, and also what sort of documentation they provide following the heat treatment. Are you going to get thermal history charts? Are you going to get evidence that the equipment is calibrated, and is it readily available? Obviously, competence of staff. Anybody that's doing work for you, you've got to make sure that they are competent. So if you're using a company to do welding, who's in charge of the welding? Have they got a recognised welding coordinator? Is he a European welding engineer, or has he got lots of years of experience? So these are some of the questions you should ask. And obviously with welding, you've got to look at repair rates. Industry is just generally less than 2%. That's what people generally aim for. But obviously, you want to make sure that the repair rates are quite low. To obviously any extra repair could involve expense, and I'm sure a late contract as well. So non-conformances, if there's any non-conformances, how are they addressed? How are they issued? How are they closed out? And are competent people closing them out within the areas of the non-conformance, not people that are not competent in that area? Is there a calibration log for all the equipment that they maintain? Do they have evidence to support the work they've done, and have a look at previous contracts? Does the contractor perform all the work himself, or does he subcontract it to others? Obviously, this is really important, because then it's not one step, it's two steps away from yourself as the manufacturer taking responsibility for the equipment. Purchase orders, obviously purchase orders are your contract on the subcontractor, and if they lose any of their approvals, if they lose their 9001 or 3834, which is quality assurance of welding operations, if you're not aware of it, then you should be informed, because there must be a reason why they've lost it in the time that the contract is going forward. Obviously, some large EPC contracts can last for several years before they're completed, so it's very important to continually monitor how they are performing, and that on your purchase order is something that, you know, it gives a requirement on them to advise you of any major changes in their systems. So the acceptance criteria, code of construction, is that clear within it? Are you ensuring that the requirements are listed in there? So the acceptance criteria or the design code. So within the purchase order, you need to put as much information as you can to make it watertight, so that the subcontractor has got a clear definition of what he's got to do. So procedures and operators for welding must be suitably qualified and endorsed by a notified body or recognised third-party organisation, unless the equipment is category 1. They must meet the harmonised standards. They must meet the essential variables as listed in the procedures when they're working. It must be suitable for the application limits of the equipment. So that could be temperature, it could be fluid service. Operators obviously must be suitably qualified. Welders must be prolongated. So every 2 years they are endorsed by a notified body or recognised third party, and every 6 months within that 2-year period they must be done internally to say that they have been continually welding. Consumables obviously must be appropriate if they're working with welding consumables. Copies of NDT procedures must be, well, there's nothing in the directive that says that they've got to be approved by a level 3, but you've got to have confidence that the procedures are suitable for the intended process or technique that's going to be applied. So we as Lloyd's Register always try and make sure that somebody in a competent position has approved these procedures. Subcontractors must inform the manufacturer if they intend to further subcontract. So that needs to be written into the purchase order. Details of concessions, variations must be provided, and details of any required information that must be provided following to ensure all work performed as appropriate evidence. So the documentation must be there to support whatever work they've done. So design information, calculations, approvals from the notified body, ensure the software is up to date to cover the latest edition of the code that you've employed. Evidence of the work done to specific standards. So obviously if they work into 31.3, ASME B 31.3, then it must say that. Material certificates, obviously all material certs must be in compliance with the design that's been given, and they must be manufactured by an organisation with a quality system certified by a competent body established within the community. And you can see that in PED Annex 1, paragraph 4.3. Obviously, welding procedures must be there and must be appropriate. They must cover the thicknesses and diameters, material types, and other essential variables to ensure that they are suitable. And same for the welder qualifications. Consumable certificates, they're generally an EM 10204 2.2 certificate, but it can be better than that. But there's not a requirement for anything higher than a 2.2 certificate. NDT operative qualifications, obviously, they're important to ensure that the people that have done the NDT are suitably qualified by an independent body. For PED, for category 3 and 4 equipment, they have to be level 2, ISO 9712 level 2 approved. NDT reports, they must meet what's required by the NDT procedures, so that the reports cover the extent of information required by the procedures and by the standard that's applied. Dimensional reports, obviously, they must detail what dimension has been done and that they meet the design criteria. So concessions, any concessions that's performed must be logged. Any audits, inspections, information must be available. Calibration of welding equipment and pressure testing equipment. Pressure testing equipment must be traceable to national standards. And any other critical information, critical calibration must also be traceable to national standards as needed. So pressure testing details. So have they done it pneumatically? Have they done it hydraulically? Any information relating to pressure testing, the duration of the test, the gauges used, etc., etc., etc. Details of safety devices. So on an assembly, you have to look at the safety device and you have to ensure that the safety devices, before the assembly is released, have been checked, and that's the final assessment, and that's covered in para 3.2.3 of Annex 1. Leak testing, that's normally done when the assembly is close to completion, to ensure that all the joints are tight, but it's generally done at a lower test pressure than the actual pressure test. It's normally done at working pressure or maximum allowable working pressure or design pressure. Marking, so the name and address of the manufacturer, the minimum operating conditions, temperature and pressure, year of manufacture and serial number. The requirement for marking is in PED Annex 1, para 3.3, and also Article 6. But on large assemblies, generally the minimum operating conditions or maximum operating conditions are on the actual equipment rather than on the assembly nameplate. Conformity, and obviously the final declaration of conformity, and also declarations of conformity for other parts that have been CE marked prior to the assembly being completed. So references, obviously the PED 2014-68 EU has been out since July 2016, so it's been around for quite a while now. The original Directive 97/23 EC came out in 2002, but there hasn't been many changes, but there are some important changes in relation to fluids, and some of the modules have changed slightly. But if you have any questions in relation to that, then you can always contact us. The Blue Guide, obviously that gives a guide to the implementation of directives, and I think that is a very useful document, and it's free to download off the internet, same as the PED.
We'd like to thank you for downloading our webinar today, and don't forget, if you have any questions, please submit them to inspection@lr.org with PED Subcontractors webinar in the subject line. Thank you for listening.